Good afternoon, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm so happy to be in Korea, and it's such a fantastic event. Thank you very, very much for having me here today. So this afternoon, I'd like to share with you the story of how we built the Tech for Good ecosystem in the UK through Bethnal Green Ventures. I'll take you on our journey from weekend hackathons to a $50 million venture capital fund, and share a bit about what we've learned about supporting Tech for Good and AI for Good ventures. We'll also talk a little bit about how we measure the impact of the ventures that we support are having, and a bit about how I think the Tech for Good ecosystem might develop in the future. So let me take you way back to 2008. And I received an unusual invitation. It was from the UK government, and they wanted to discuss how technology could solve problems in aging and education and sustainability. And so I put on my suit and my tie, and I went to a very impressive government building in London. And we climbed a grand staircase, and there was the government minister waiting to hear our wise thoughts. And the discussion was interesting, don't get me wrong, but I was really struck that at the end of the meeting, the government officials, all they could think of to do was to start a consultation and to write a white paper about the social use of technology. And on the train, on the way home, with a few other people who'd been at the event, back to Bethnal Green in East London, I talked with them, and we decided, well, why don't we just do something rather than write something? So we quickly created a website inviting people to a social innovation camp. We borrowed a space in the Young Foundation, which was where I was running a startup at the time. And a few weeks later, with some sponsorship for pizza and drinks, we held our first event. And we brought together the talented developers and engineers and designers we knew with people who really understood particular social problems. And that was anything from how to help young offenders stay out of prison, through to helping young people connect with older people, or reducing food waste. And the weekend was an amazing success. The energy, the buzz was incredible. And people came up to me afterwards and said, how do I quit my job and work on this? How do I do this kind of thing full time? So we continued to run those social innovation camps regularly, and we created a playbook that we opened up, and the model spread to 25 other countries, including Korea. And we built this strong community of potential founders of Tech for Good businesses. But around about the same time, there was another model that I noticed, which was the Startup Accelerator, which was just starting to really take hold in the US. And the reason for this was the cost of starting a technology startup was going down. So you no longer needed big servers or to buy expensive software licenses. People could start companies for tens of thousands of dollars rather than millions of dollars. And that makes a big difference, because investors could support 10 startups with small investments rather than one startup with a big investment. And that means you improve your chances of success. And I studied these models, and I wrote a report at the time called the Startup Factories, examining how accelerators like Y Combinator and Techstars could work in Europe. And I saw an opportunity to bring this model to advance the Tech for Good community in the UK. So in 2012, during the London Olympics, we launched Bethnal Green Ventures, where we took 6 startups and we offered a small amount of investment as well as lots of support and a peer group for learning from each other. And it worked. And it was a truly cross-sectoral partnership, really, because the capital was provided by a foundation, the office space and the tech support was provided by Google, and we had no trouble finding mentors or people who wanted to share their knowledge with these founders who were trying to solve really important social and environmental problems. And I'll be honest and say we got lucky, because 2 of those 6 startups that we backed, which were just ideas at the time, went on to become multi-million-pound businesses. Fairphone changed the way that the consumer electronics industry thought about sustainability and repairability. I'll talk a little bit more about them in the future, later on. And Doctor changed how the UK's National Health Service thinks about using technology to improve health administration and the patient experience. And they're now used by the majority of UK citizens. And near the end of that first program, that accelerator program that we ran, I had a visit from someone who'd been at the original meeting in the government building. He'd now been promoted, and he had a bit of money to invest. And he was impressed with what we'd done, and so he helped create something called the Social Incubator Fund, which had £10 million to back accelerators and social tech incubators in the UK. And one of those was Bethnal Green Ventures, and it was super important in our development. And actually, although they invested £10 million, there was a report afterwards that said that even just one of the ventures that they'd backed had actually saved the government over £100 million. So that simple investment on the part of the government paid off in a big way. But for us, the funding allowed us to learn, test, and improve our Tech for Good program for startups. And we supported 6 more cohorts of ventures, and we realized that their needs were changing as the ecosystem developed. Now, they didn't just need that first step, they needed follow-on support and follow-on investment. And so in 2016, we raised money from an organization called Better Society Capital, which had set up using the money from dormant bank accounts to invest in impact. We started making follow-on investments with that, and we're no longer just running events or programs. We realized actually we'd become a venture capital firm. And we continued backing roughly 20 companies a year at that idea stage and making follow-ons into the ones that were becoming successful. But we also noticed that the world around us was changing, and actually other, more mainstream investors were getting interested in our startups because I think they were recognizing that because our businesses were solving real problems, they were creating real value. So as the mainstream caught up a little bit, we had to get serious about what made our work different. And I think that was doubling down on the fact that we were impact investors. Now, you might have come across this before, but impact investment is defined as deliberately or intentionally using investment to deliver a positive social or environmental impact alongside financial returns, and to do that in a measurable way. And so we focused on the Tech for Good founders who were using technology to deliberately have a positive social or environmental impact, who also wanted to create a high-growth, valuable business, and who were willing to measure the impact and improve the standard of evidence of their impact as they grow. So in some ways, we think about it not as a spectrum with high impact at one end and high growth or high returns at the other, but as a Venn diagram, as 2 circles. And so you have businesses that do both in the middle, and that's the bit that we're interested in at Bethnal Green Ventures, the Tech for Good startups that are both high growth but also high impact. And the way that that impact is measured and demonstrated is super important to us. We believe that measuring impact should go hand in hand with building a successful business. It should be useful as you grow the business, as you build the business. And so right from the very start, we work with founders to identify what metrics will genuinely reflect the change that they're trying to achieve in the world, but will also grow with their product or service. So the more of the product or service that they sell, the more positive impact they should have. We also take a staged approach to impact measurement. So we think of very early stage startups differently to startups that are at the growth stage, for example. And we like to talk about the standard of their evidence improving. So in the early days, that may be that they measure their impact themselves, and it's a very simple way of measuring it, just getting feedback from users or counting the impact they had almost. But as they grow, we want to see that become verified by independent sources, and eventually we want to see them able to show that their impact is better and stronger and has more authenticity than their competitors as well. We think that building strong evidence for your impact is a real advantage as you grow as a startup, because it helps to build trust with customers, investors, regulators, and society more broadly. So that's really what I think sets Tech for Good venture capital apart from venture capital more generally. Just to give you a bit of an example of the kinds of businesses that we back. So I'll give you a couple of stories of the founders. So first of all, take Ellen. So Ellen grew up on a farm in Wales. She became a nurse, a children's nurse. And when she was working at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, she noticed how many problems there were with clinical trials that involve children. Trials rely on regularly monitoring patients. And in some cases, this meant that the kids were having to travel hundreds of miles back to hospital just for a few simple checks. This was leading to clinical trials failing, not because the drugs or interventions weren't working, but because they couldn't collect enough high-quality data. Ellen thought, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And she realized that by using tech, in her case, wearable devices or the cameras in smartphones, she could collect data without the kids having to travel to hospital. And that data would actually be more reliable because the children and their families wouldn't be stressed by the journey to the hospital or by the white coat effect, as it's sometimes called, of being in hospital. And the company that she created to do that was called Apparito. It built the technology to safely collect and share that data with the clinical trials. And last year, actually, one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies came knocking and bought the whole company. And they're rolling it out across all of their clinical trials. So really scaling up the impact that Apparito is able to have. And hopefully helping more clinical trials for drugs for children work and improve the health of kids all around the world. So for those kids and their families, that tech really is a piece of magic. Or another example, Fairphone, that I mentioned earlier. So Bas here was an engineer and designer. He grew up in the Netherlands. And as smartphones started to take off, Bas just started to wonder what was in them. He wondered where the materials inside them came from. And as he started to explore it, he didn't like what he saw. He found some pretty nasty things were going on in the supply chains of those phones. Actually, what he found is that every smartphone contains around 40 different minerals. There's tantalum, tungsten, copper, gold, palladium, all these exotic-sounding metals and minerals. And all these metals and minerals enter the supply chain from the mining industry, which isn't a sector that's best known for CSR and sustainability practices. He also found that the manufacturing left a lot to be desired in terms of the human rights and the working conditions of the people there. And he became convinced that actually the big brands at the time, this is back in 2011, 2012, didn't really know what was in the phones. The supply chain was so complex that they'd lost track of what was there. And he thought, okay, well, if I talk to them, surely they'll change. But although they said nice things about it, they didn't change. And so he started campaigning and writing public reports about it. But again, the companies signed up to some codes of conduct, things like that, but he knew that nothing was really changed. And he told me this when he came and pitched BGV, because he came and he said, Paul, we've become convinced that if we want to change the mobile phone industry or the smartphone industry, we need to create our own smartphone. And so Fairphone was born. And Baz and the team turned the industry on its head. And they, bit by bit, they improved the supply chain of their phones. In turn, that has now improved the supply chain of the big firms. So just one example, Samsung and Apple now use fair trade gold in their phones in a mine that was originally certified for Fairphone. So they have not just had an impact themselves, but they've impacted the whole industry. And I think one of the key things that they did was put their community at the heart of the company. So when they started out, they crowdfunded the phone, essentially. So when they launched for pre-sales in 2013, over 8 million euros was pledged in a matter of a few hours from people for a phone that didn't exist yet, a phone that people wanted to exist. And Baz took that urge to solve the problem and has built a company out of it. And Fairphone has now sold over 500,000 phones and has annual revenues of over $50 million. So as we supported founders like Ellen and Baz, we realized that the ecosystem was getting bigger and bigger. And we saw more and more investors identifying as tech for good or impact tech. And there was also the launch of the B Corp movement, which has been really influential in Europe. And actually, Bethnal Green Ventures was the first VC firm in the UK to become a B Corp. And we decided to capitalize on that growth. And in 2023, we raised our biggest fund ever. It's around $50 million, and it's anchored by the British Business Bank and includes family offices, big companies, and endowments. And we can now offer over $1 million in follow-on funding to those companies that we support from the very earliest stages. And I'd say that actually the journey, when I think about it, has been characterized by partnerships between government, companies, investors, and those startup founders. None of them could have done it on their own. And it really requires that kind of collaboration to build the support ecosystem that Tech for Good founders need. Let's talk a little bit about AI. I mean, many applications that we now get at Bethnal Green Ventures are centered on AI. We've had to think carefully about what AI for good really means. And actually, one of the first things we noticed was that people were using AI to write their applications to Bethnal Green Ventures. So when we do our call for ventures twice a year, we noticed sort of ChatGPT-like phrases turning up in those applications. But rather than trying to stop people doing that, we decided to ask them a question about, so as they, at the end, saying how they'd used AI in their application and why. And what we found was actually that in many cases, people were using it in some ways because they were felt a bit excluded by the language of venture capital. And actually, it was people from underrepresented backgrounds were using it almost as a leg up to help them to talk to the VC world, which I thought was really interesting. In some ways, AI was leveling the playing field and helping people who didn't understand how VC and the startup world worked to communicate, which I thought was really interesting. More broadly, for us, it's really important that AI is used in a responsible, open, and measurable way. So we work with a lot of other organizations to try and develop guidelines for startups and for investors around the responsible use of AI. For us, it's really that we believe that AI shouldn't be a black box. Startups should be clear about how they use people's data and what benefits they might get in return. Another thing that I think is interesting around AI is actually it might make the impact measurement side of Tech for Good easier. We're already seeing lots of tools for collecting feedback, for measuring environmental change using satellites and so on, or tracking health changes that use AI. They're much more available, much more sophisticated than they were even a couple of years ago. So I think AI is helping with that impact measurement piece in ways that could help Tech for Good startups differentiate themselves in the future compared to startups that don't care about their impact, really. So what's next for Tech for Good and for Bethnal Green Ventures? Well, in the UK, at least, we see no slowing in founders who want to use their skills to solve big social and environmental problems. Our last call for ventures, which closed a couple of months ago, was our most popular ever. And looking at how much the Tech for Good ecosystem has developed over the last 10 years, I think it's grown at least 10 times. I expect that to continue. I think it's going to grow another 10 times in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think finally, actually, the big asset owners in the UK are starting to recognize that they can have a positive impact as well. And there's a lot of talk in the UK about how our pension funds should be pushed more towards impact investing and backing companies that have a positive, measurable impact on people's lives. In the current geopolitical system, if you can call it that, I also think regions around the world are going to try to become a bit more interested in self-sufficiency when it comes to technology. And that creates lots of opportunities for startups to become the number one player in Europe or in Asia or even in smaller regions than that. And I think that's really interesting and a change compared to the era of big tech that we're coming out of. I think there's much more room for collaboration between different countries around tech for good as well. We have slightly different problems to solve, but some of the problems that you've been talking about today are absolutely problems in the UK, whether that's hyper-aging or dementia or whatever it might be. So I think there's lots of common things as well. And the Tech for Good ecosystem has reached a point where I think that international collaboration could be really, really useful. My message, I think, that I want to leave you with is that things move too fast now for us to succeed alone. We need to keep learning and help each other overcome the problems and the challenges that we have in the world when we're trying to apply tech for good. And growing the global tech for good movement benefits everyone. The larger the movement, the more value we'll all get. So I'm super happy to be here in Korea today. I hope I've shared something useful about our journey at Bethnal Green Ventures. And I hope the Tech for Good and the AI for Good movement in Korea will continue to grow because the problems we face are massive. And the only way we'll solve them is by getting more people involved. So thank you very much for listening this afternoon.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저는 인비저닝파트너스의 재현주라고 합니다. 일단 I'll actually do the intro about 인비저닝파트너스 in Korean and then get back in English. Yeah. 예, 저희 회사 소개는 충분히 제가 포레게 미리 했기 때문에 저는 어떤 투자를 하고 있는지 짧게 소개해드리고 그리고 그 Q&A 세션을 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 그 인비저닝파트너스는 기본적으로 방금 전에 들으신 베스널 그린 벤처스와 마찬가지로 임팩트 투자를 하고 있는 벤처 캐피털 펌이고요. 그리고 저희도 한국에 사실 몇 안 되는 Bcorp 인증을 받은 투자 기관입니다. 저희는 저희가 하는 투자를 그 중요한 사회적인 환경적인 그러니까 우리 시대의 중요한 사회적 환경적 문제를 커다란 시장의 기회로 바꿔내는 기업들에 투자한다. 라고 저희가 하는 일을 정의합니다. 임팩트 투자라고 하는 말을 많은 사람들이 굉장히 다양한 방식으로 해석할 수 있는데요. 아까 폴이 보여준 것 같은 그 다이어그램의 그 교차점에 교집합에 투자를 하는 것과 마찬가지로 또 상업적인 성장성과 문제를 해결해내는 임팩트가 서로 결합되어서 오히려 시너지를 일으킬 수 있는 그래서 높은 성장률을 통해서 큰 임팩트를 창출해낼 수 있는 기업에 투자한다라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 저희는 주로 저희가 또 하나 이제 저희를 정의하는 방식 중에 하나가 도메인 포커스드 인베스트먼트 펌이라고 하는 건데요. 그 도메인은 저희가 임팩트 도메인이라고 보통 표현을 합니다. 그래서 우리 시대의 중요한 사회적 문제이면서 동시에 커다란 성장의 기회를 갖고 있는 그 교차점이 되는 영역들 그 도메인들에 집중해서 우리도 투자자로서 전문성을 키워나가면서 투자를 한다라고 하는 의미입니다. 그래서 그렇게 저희가 포커스하는 도메인은 크게 세 가지인데요. 하나는 누구도 이제 그 반론을 제기할 수 없는 우리 시대의 심각한 문제인 Climate and Energy Solutions가 첫 번째 영역이고요. 그다음에 두 번째는 굉장히 그 인구의 그 초고령화와 인구 분포의 변화로 인해서 생겨나는 새로운 건강상의 이슈들을 해결하는 Health Solutions. 그리고 마지막은 또 이런 인구 구조의 변화와 함께 더불어서 생겨나는 그리고 또 새로운 기술들이 등장하면서 생겨나는 노동 시장에서의 변화에 대응하는 솔루션, Work Solutions. 이렇게 세 가지 영역에 투자를 하고 있습니다. 이제까지 저희가 총 55개의 기업에 투자를 했고요. 지금 약 한 2,800억 정도의 운용 자산을 운용하고 있습니다. 그 베스널 그린 벤처스 대비해서는 저희가 약간 더 레이 스테이지에 투자를 하지만 근본적으로 투자를 하는 그 필라소피나 전략은 굉장히 유사하다라고 하는 거를 저희가 논의를 하면서 느꼈고요. 근데 다만 한국이라는 시장 환경과 그 영국이라는 시장 환경의 차이가 그 만들어내는 차이점들이 이 사전에 대화를 하는 동안 굉장히 흥미롭게 졌다는 말씀 드리고 싶습니다. So now we will get to the questions I prepared for you, and these are actually all the questions I get a lot when I talk with our investors and also the founders of the startups. So if your answers today will give me a lot of hints for these questions going forward. The first question is actually about evaluating the commercial growth potential and the impact at the same time. And you invest usually in a very early stage startups, founders, even before setting a company itself. And there's not much data actually to do the due diligence on. So when you have to assess whether these companies or these founders can truly integrate financial, like a commercial growth potential with the impact, environmental or social impact, what signals or evidences, do you look for most?
Sure. Yeah, so it's we often look for founders who really understand the problem they're trying to solve, and one of the tells I think is that they can teach us something about the problem that we don't know. So where they're talking about it in a way that you're like, I didn't know that. And one of the really interesting moments is when you realize that there's more money involved in that problem than perhaps you thought beforehand. So this isn't necessarily about sort of market sizing, but because they've got such detailed understanding of the problem they're trying to solve, they know how the money works as well, and that's a really good sign that there is a commercial potential there as well. So really it is down to the founders to convince us, but they're usually convincing us by their understanding of the problem and the system that they're working in, rather than with data based on their revenues or whatever it might be. So it's a different way of doing it, but it's been quite reliable actually as an indicator of how likely it is for that business to grow.
So it's really the obsession about the problem itself is really the kind of the...
Yeah, and I think there's often this piece that, founders might be solving a particular problem with their product or service, but they recognize that they're working in a bigger system, and so they understand how the money moves around them. And that if you find founders where that's the case, it's a really good sign.
In our investment process, we try to understand a theory of change.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that
exactly
resonated with the concept. Yeah. Thank you. And actually, in line with that, this is really the, never-ending, never-dying question. And I think it would be in the pretty similar situation. Many people still believe that pursuing both commercial growth and positive impact at the same time inevitably requires sacrificing for one another. So, what would you say to those who hold that view? And do you think this debate will disappear? Eventually, from the VC market in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because on one level, I do think it's true. As in, there certainly are examples where there are trade-offs, but I think it's not true for all companies. So there, as I sort of put in the slides, I think it's two circles. You have the high growth, valuable businesses, and you have the high impact businesses, and there is an overlap. And one of the advantages of our model is that we get hundreds and hundreds of applications for every time we run our program. And so actually we can afford to ignore the ones that fall outside of the overlap. Yeah. So we can just focus on ones where the business model is linked to the impact. And it's a real luxury for us as investors, but it means that almost never does that conflict or that trade-off ever come up with the businesses as they grow, because from the get-go, they've decided that their business model is linked to their impact.
Yeah. I think within the impact ecosystem, we need different types of money. And sometimes, we have to invest in the area where there is a trade-off between the impact and the commercial growth. But as a venture capitalist investing in a tech for good or the impact startups,
absolutely. I think there are different types of tech for good funders and investors, and that's great. That actually is a sign of a mature ecosystem when you have got some funders who are willing to give grants to sort of do things that just focus on the impact, and you've got some founders who want to almost like sort of minimize how much they talk about their impact because they just want to appeal to really, really, sort of profit-driven investors. And that's great to have that range, but at BGV, we're super clear about which bit that we focus on.
Yeah, I think, people who do not want to believe you can pursue the commercial growth and the impact at the same time, think that there cannot be synergy between the two factors. I think in many cases we see, commercial growth potential is really the kind of the tool for the impact scale up. But when a certain company, when a certain impact creating company reaches a certain reaches a large scale, you don't think it's not you don't think it's an impact startup anymore. So I think that's kind of the
and I think that's the thing that's changing the minds of investors in the UK is the examples. So when they say that, you can say, well, what about Doctor or Fairphone or whatever it might be, and the examples are gradually convincing people that it is possible.
Yeah, I think we just really need a lot of good examples delivering the great impact and a good commercial success. And that was actually one part very interesting to me in your talk. You mentioned you take a staged approach for impact measurement. So the impact measurement evolves alongside business growth. That was quite insightful because especially for myself, when we talk about how we monitor the impact with our portfolio companies, sometimes we are concerned whether this impact measurement can be really the burden for them when they have to really focus on the business and they have a lot of things on the plate, especially when the team is small. So I would like to understand kind of the actual approach in terms of this staged approach for impact measurement. Can you share a specific example from your portfolio?
I think for example, in some of our sort of medical or health-related startups, that shows it. So there's a startup, for example, called Skin Analytics, who use AI to analyze images of your skin to tell whether something is skin cancer or not. And they were actually like one of the first companies in the world to focus on this. They've been doing this back since sort of 2014. And when they first started out, that was really just a theory of change. It was just we think that if our product or service is used, we can reduce the number of people suffering from skin cancer. And obviously, they had to show over time whether it was safe, and then whether it was better than other approaches, and then finally whether they could do it at scale. And each of those stages required different evidence. So they went from a prototype to being able to show in a controlled environment that it was as good as a doctor, but they were doing it alongside doctors so as it was safe. Then they went to a proper independent clinical trial that showed that it could be used as a clinical intervention, and now they are being rolled out across the whole NHS. and now so their measurement now is about how many lives they've saved. But that's got a much higher bar for the evidence that you need it. So there's no way they could have done that on day one, and all the evidence that they would have required to collect that. But over time, they've managed to really be able to show that they are having a positive impact.
Actually, this was not in the prepared list, but while hearing your answer, I actually would like to get your view about the translating impact into the dollar term.
Yep.
I mean, there is a big camp who try to do that. So what is your view on that approach?
So it's not something that we do universally. I think there are cases where it makes sense, and there's an interesting movement, actually, particularly in public services in the UK, usually known as payment by results, where the government will effectively pay for services if they achieve particular public service results. And that's driven some startups down that route, I think, which is interesting. But I don't think it applies everywhere. I think in many cases, actually, the impact is, it's intrinsic to the product or service, but maybe not intrinsic to how much people will pay for it. So the price varies, but the impact stays the same.
Yeah, thank you. Getting to the journey of your firm, I mean, what do you see as the key internal and external factors that made it possible? And when was the time you felt the most at risk due to external environmental changes?
Yeah, I think we've, very unusually for VC firms, we've been very transparent and open, and we share almost everything that we learn along the way. So certainly when we started, there were lots of VC firms in the UK that didn't even have a website. They were so secretive about what they were up to. So the culture of venture capital. And so when we came along and were just, this is what we're doing, and had open applications, and we have a rule of no warm intro needed, which is pretty unusual for the venture capital firm. So I think that openness and transparency has really helped us, and that means that we're very willing to work in partnership with tech companies or the government or whoever it might be. That's helped us, to be honest, I think. The moments we felt most under threat, there's two. One was Brexit, where just the makeup of founders in the UK changed because you no longer had free movement within Europe for founders. So suddenly we saw a drop in the number of European founders that we were backing. That has started to recover now a bit. That people understand how it works and so on, I think. But that felt quite precarious, I think. And the other was actually I think we moved too soon on this pension funds thing that I mentioned. So we actually 5 years ago now we tried to start working with pension funds, but they weren't ready for it yet. And again, we put a lot of energy into trying to get pension funds to do impact investing. But the truth of it was, looking back now, they weren't quite ready. And so we put a lot of energy into that, but it didn't work. And that was difficult.
Yeah, I hear you, and I could probably echo a lot of what you've said. And in actually line with that, in Korea is actually very famous for its 빨리빨리, like hurry culture. And I think this can be really our strengths and a weakness at the same time. But building an ecosystem, usually takes time. And you really need to be patient throughout the journey. But if you give an advice to the people in Korea, whether how you can build an ecosystem fast while doing it right, could you give some hints on that?
Yeah, I think start from the roots. So when I look across different European countries, the ones that have been most successful are the ones that really worked on supporting early stage entrepreneurs, either with some government support or by having organizations who focused on that early stage. Because if you've got a really big community of founders who are just like wanting to go and have got some support to do that, then I think a lot of good things come from that. And you can build with them as they grow over time. You can do that. I think if there's been a couple of examples where I think, for good reason, governments or big investors have thought, oh, well, we need to do it at this amount of millions of dollars, so we have to start with the big ones. And that can be a bit stifling, I think, because for the founders who are wanting to get started, that looks unattainable. And so, I think there's starting with the grassroots is a really, really important piece of it, I think. And the other is the one I've mentioned already about partnership, because the truth is that no one sector or type of organization can grow an ecosystem on its own. You need to have lots of people coming together, bringing different aspects to it. We were lucky in the UK that there were different organizations in different sectors who really sort of clicked and got that this was important.
I agree with you, and while working as an impact investor, in terms of daily tasks, I feel that most of the tasks are quite similar with just conventional VCs. Yeah. But the biggest difference would be really the advocacy and the communication with the partners. You try to really convince the other stakeholders why we need this type of investment, and really the try to move more people, more resources into the ecosystem. Yeah. So I think that you're absolutely right. And this is my final question, and hopefully we have some time to cover a lot of questions here. Looking ahead 5 years, which specific areas within the tech for good space do you expect to grow the fastest or emerging as a new opportunity for many founders?
The interesting ones that we've seen a lot more interest in from founders recently are aging, which we've been talking about today, and I think there's a problem. I think there are all kinds of ethical and cultural issues that we'll need to overcome to really do that well, and it's one that really requires system change as well, because the funding system around elder care is just I don't know what it's like in Korea, but it's broken in the UK. It's not good. So there's lots of things that need to change. Another area is actually in some ways it's a difficult story, but it's essentially adapting to climate change, and particularly around agriculture. So we've seen a lot more interest in what's usually called controlled environment agriculture, so greenhouses and indoor farming. And I think that sort of food security piece, it feels like that's going to really grow quite a lot over the next few years. Actually
the change in demographics and the climate change simultaneously impact agriculture.
Exactly, your themes, aren't they? So,
and we need really the young talent, tech talent in agriculture in Korea as well. Hopefully I can at least cover a couple of questions from the audience. I think these are, let me see, I need to translate this into English. The first question was actually saying that he or she was quite impressed with the case of Fairphone, and but the environmental sector, the sector related with the climate crisis, seems relatively, smaller than the market for the a medical service or education. And how can we stimulate, facilitate more investment into the solutions for climate crisis, environmental problems, and biodiversity? That's
a good question. So I guess how do you, if you had $100 million, how should you allocate it is one way of thinking about it. What we found is that actually many of these problems are way bigger commercial opportunities than people think in the first place anyway. So we don't worry too much about how we're allocating our capital according to different sectors, because our experience is that actually the businesses of the future always surprise us as to like where the value lies, and it's very hard as investors to predict that. I think you'll hear a lot of investors saying, "Oh, we have these amazing market sizing tools and all these kinds of things," but the truth is that's about markets now, not about markets in the future. And actually, yeah. We don't worry too much about it as investors ourselves, because we know that things are going to change. So it's not a question that we look at too much. But I absolutely agree that some areas are underinvested. But I think that's generally because investors tend to look at what do people spend money on now rather than thinking of what could they spend money on in the future.
Yep, the venture capital investment is inherently long-term investment, so we need to really look forward. Time's up. So 많은 질문 주셨는데 커버하기 시간 관계상 커버하지 못해서 좀 아쉽고요. 오늘 같이 함께 해주셔서 정말 감사드립니다. Thank you for your insights, and it was really great having you here on the stage.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
카카오